Christianity Today, amongst other groups, attempting to promote a sexual ethic that goes against what the Bible has to say on the matter. That is what I had promised the audience during Sunday's live stream that we would be covering, and that is exactly why I am covering this topic on this live stream of Irrespective. By the way, just to let everybody know, this might not be something that we might be able to cover in just one live stream episode. We might have to take another and possibly even three to talk about all of the ramifications and errors that are peddled here by the various authors that we will be quoting from Christianity Today henceforth. Anyways, for those of you that might be joining us for the first time, welcome. For those of you that are returning subscribers, thank you so much for subscribing and for watching these live streams. A couple of housekeeping items before we continue during this episode. If you have not done so yet, we would encourage you to subscribe, to hit that notification bell to be alerted as to when we go live, which is, as it is now, Wednesdays, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Sundays, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Do not forget to click on that thumbs up button. Smash it, please, and share our content with others. It is the best way to let others know of the existence of Irrespective. You can also interact with us by placing your questions and or comments in the chat, whether you're watching this on X, YouTube, or Rumble. Do not forget to donate. It helps us to continue to do these live streams for your edification and for your illumination. There's a QR code in the upper left-hand corner of the screen that you can scan. Conversely, there is a link that is available to you in the description box beneath the video player. And last but not least, do not forget to follow us on the socials. On X, you can find us under the username Irrespective77, and on TikTok, you can follow us at the Irrespective is the username there. All right. There are three articles that I had talked about on the Sunday live stream that I'd like to quote from. Although some of these articles are rather short in duration, I might read from them in their entirety and then pause intermittently in order to comment on the matter. But I think it's important that we set a contextual understanding, a framework for the reason that I am approaching this camera, using this microphone, using the internet to talk about this matter. Understand that Christianity Today has for some time now been controlled opposition. What do I mean by controlled opposition? It has been headed by, staffed by people whom do not believe in what we know as traditional or Orthodox Christianity. By Orthodox Christianity, I'm not talking about Greek or Eastern Orthodox. I'm not making mention of those organizations. I'm talking about Orthodox Christianity, meaning what is read straight from the book, a plain reading, understanding of the text, and looking to implement that in a straightforward way in Christian living. Christianity Today has been in the forefront in many instances in this sort of attack against a traditional understanding and Orthodox understanding of biblical truth. So it should not surprise any of us, it certainly doesn't surprise me, that Christianity Today were to put forth these three articles that have now caused some sort of a stir in Christian circles. The three articles that I am talking about here are, first, Men Should Bear the Brunt of Contraception by Justin Whitmel Early. The second, What the Awkwardness of Sterilization Tells Us by Caitlin Walls Shelton. Seems as all of these authors love their three names. And Christians Need Clearer Thinking About Sterilization, Matthew Lee Anderson. It almost appears to me as if these people's parents, they put names in a blender, and the first two that popped out, they said, those are good names and surnames that we should add to our already existing last names. Anyways, the entire concept here, as you can already tell from the titles themselves, are trying to peddle a particular idea with respect to sterilization. And this is a question that continues to be debated, hotly debated amongst Christians, and I think it's an important one to talk about. Because there are various factors that Christians tend to put, as it were, in that consideration, in that bucket of consideration, when making decisions as to whether or not a couple is going to have children or not. And I would dare say that most of those considerations really have to do with worldly considerations more so than biblical standards. Why would I say that? Because And this is just an observable fact. I'm not going to quote any statistics. I'm not going to quote any poll. I'm going to speak here mostly from experience, as it were, having served as an associate pastor, as a minister for some time now, and also simple observation tells you that this is the case. Most young couples have been more indoctrinated with thinking first and foremost about worldly considerations than they are about how to apply biblical standards to the world that they are living in and how to live in a more Christian manner in the world that they are operating in. That is the modus operandi, as we have already profiled on these live streams over and over again from a lot of churches. That is the framework from which churches tend to operate nowadays. So therefore, any topic or any particular phenomenon that runs afoul of whatever the current worldly scheme or trend is, or let me put it this way, I think it's a better way to put it, any biblical standard that necessarily runs afoul of how the world is necessarily thinking and Christians are adopting, even though it goes against what the text has to say, churches are very hesitant to even talk about those things. I remind the audience of something we spoke about recently. For example, Judah Smith. There's a language, there's a phrase that he loves to use, he and his wife love to use, that reminds me a lot of Carl Lentz and a lot of those seeker-friendly types. When they ask them pointed questions about abortion, about homosexuality, almost always they revert back to that morally ambiguous line of, we just want to hear your story and we want to minister to that story. It's a mealy-mouthed way to try to avoid and evade the question, which should be answered directly because the Bible has answers to these things. The thing is that these people don't want to lose any popularity. They don't want to be criticized. And therefore, there are two roads, and this is the point I wanted to get to, that Christians that are more secularist than anything else, and as ironic as that sounds, I think the audience will understand what I mean by that. Even the Bible addresses this issue of spiritual adultery, where you'll have Christians that they tend to give, or self-professed Christians, that they tend to give more weight to the way the world operates, and that's the way that they think and that's the way that they behave, than allowing the Bible to speak into their existence, and then allowing the Bible to, through the renewing of the mind, to reshape the way that they think and the way that they act, even though it goes diametrically opposed to the way that the world operates and thinks. This is one of the things that we were talking about most recently in one of our most recent live streams, where Romans 12, 1 and 2 couldn't be any clearer. Paul says that we must submit ourselves to the renewing of the mind. And the renewing of the mind, part of that entire process is to allow us to get to a point where we are more like Christ, ever more like Christ, and less like the world. If not, what's the purpose then of calling ourselves Christians if we're not in any way, shape, or form going to try to be imitators of Christ? Paul himself says, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. That is one of the primary calls of Christians. Unfortunately, the latter, everything, or the former rather, what I just talked about, this tendency to be more secularist than Christian, also affects the way that Christians, modern Christians, view sexual relations. This is why we see such a cowardice in Christian circles to talk about the sins of homosexuality, fornication, etc., 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 even though the Bible couldn't be any clearer about these sorts of comportments. Well, some would say that sterilization then is in that hazy area. It's one of those areas where the Bible doesn't necessarily speak to the matter, but that we can infer certain things that allows us to give us certain guidelines, they'll call it, instead of outright prohibitions or go-aheads, outright green lights. And I would dare say that that's not only just an oversimplification, I think there's an awful lot of obfuscation in the matter. More on that shortly, because the first thing I'd like to do here is to quote from the Christianity Today, the first article that I had read the title from, Men Should Bear the Brunt of Contraception, Justin Whitmel Early. I mention all of this, I mention Christianity Today because do remember, this is a magazine, an online magazine, and they were a physical magazine. I don't know if they're still publishing their stuff in print, probably. I haven't read an issue of Christianity Today and God knows how long, and God knows it's been good for my mind and for my soul, but sometimes it's necessary to delve into these sorts of things to or alert Christians as to what it is that certain secularized believers, again, as ironic as that sounds, are attempting to peddle to Christians now. And Christianity today seems to have gotten in that boat now where they're saying, hey, we're going to speak to that void. We're going to speak to that ambiguity, some will say. And we're going to give clarity on the matter as to what pertains here and what we should infer here and what we should gather from that place over there. Well, I'll read the article, the first article, and I'll intersperse my comments here to give you an idea. Remember, this is just a first in a series of 3 where they've talked about this particular issue, and we will go back and forth here, not only in my comments, but also intersperse biblical verses to prove that a lot of the ideas that these people are peddling are, in fact, problematic, if not outright anti-biblical. Again, men should bear the brunt of contraception by Justin Whitmel Early. Sterilization should never be done carelessly, and it should be the man's burden. That's a heavy claim when one thinks about it, and evidently, he's going to be able to prove his point. I vividly remember crying in the kitchen with my wife, Lauren. I was doing some dishes when Lauren put a pregnancy test on the counter next to me. That moment was totally unlike the others. I need to point out, before I continue to read, most of these authors, you'll note that they end up starting the articles where they're trying to make certain cases or they're trying to make a point with personal anecdotes. And if possible, they try to use as emotional an anecdote as possible to give weight to their argumentation. But as we've stated before on these live streams, one has to divorce oneself, in a sense, from the emotive in these things to talk about the essential truth of the matter, because humans, as a point, the Bible talks very clearly about this, our emotions can be flawed, our emotions can be tainted by sin. I'm not saying that emotions themselves are wrong. Jesus says that we should weep with those that weep, and we should be joyous with those that are enjoying a season of joy in their life, or for those instances. That's not a problem. The problem is that emotions can also be affected and informed by sin or by righteousness. So emotions are not a good thing to make a case on, as it were. Absolute truth is, but not emotion. So we already have a problem here from the very beginning, but there's also a bit of machination here, shall we say, from the onset that one has to keep in mind, aside from the fact that there are some other things that we can comment on, but I don't want to get away from the center point here. That comment was totally unlike the others. That moment was totally unlike the others, he writes, where there was waiting, joy, and celebration. This one felt like a punishment and a total surprise. We already had 3 rambunctious boys under the age of 5. What's more, the pregnancies had been hard on Lauren's health. Her midwives had recommended against having another pregnancy for a while. I need to pause here for a second, because there's a segment of believers who have a tendency to believe that the dominion mandate, be fruitful and multiply, has to be fulfilled by Christians. And I agree with that. The problem is they have a tendency to take these ideas to dangerous places. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm not going to discount a portion of his commentary here, because I have heard from various persons, and we're talking about traditionalists here. I'm talking about people whom are homesteaders that, in a sense, they kind of reject a lot of industrialized life, where they themselves say that in rural communities and in communities that they hold out somewhat from the modern conveniences of life, it has been a traditional thing to know that it's a good thing to space out those pregnancies for the sake of the mother. I even heard a pastor recently state that in his case, he has recommended to the people that he pastors to make sure that they properly space out those pregnancies for the sake of the health of the mother, that it's not necessarily a good thing for women to have children back to back to back almost immediately, because it doesn't allow the woman, as it were, to recuperate naturally, to have all of her immune system recuperate to the point where now she can deal with another child, as well as that necessarily has effects on the birth. It has necessary effects on the baby itself. If that immune system is not completely reestablished, then it can be problematic, and can necessarily, that weakened immune system response can be passed on to the child. Now, none of what I've just said, in essence, should lead the person to believe that I'm going to advocate for this method of contraception or that method of contraception, because I have my own issues and I think rightfully so, with the contraceptions that are offered, especially the pharmaceutical types, as it were, especially with their known after effects, long-term effects, and how it affects the woman in a long-term space, and even potentially the births when they get off of those contraceptive pills and things of that nature. I think if one thing has become clear in our day and age, it's that more and more Americans are waking up to the dangers of how pharmacologized, if I can use that term. I don't know if it exists, but I guess you'll understand what I mean by that. How pharmacologized we've become in our day and age, and how this is leading to deteriorating health. And this also reflects, in a sense, to pregnancies and things of that nature. So I need to bring that into the conversation here, because that's an important thing to bring forth here. But you'll notice the narrative here begins to deviate, in essence, from what I'm stating here. It doesn't epicenter on what I'm talking about here, something completely different. We already had 3 rambunctious boys under the age of 5. What's more, the pregnancies had been hard on Lauren's health. Her midwives had recommended against having another pregnancy for a while. So the question is, why then didn't this husband do something to say, let's pause for a season here so that you can improve your health if we are planning on having another child? That's an important question. A year later, 2 things were true. First, we did what many faithful people of God have done before us when faced with unexpected children. The word there is very key here, unexpected. That's an interesting use of the word here, because it gives the impression, the implication, that not only were they not using any contraceptions, artificial, but it doesn't seem as if they were using any natural contraception. By the way, when we're talking about methodologies here, modern medical industries will make you think that the only way to contracept is through the use of artificial pills or things of that nature. For eons, as it were, people were using natural forms of contraception. And I've read plenty of instances where they were practically pretty much successful. But unfortunately, in the day and age in which we live, we're so distanced from what our relatives used to think and how they used to practice things successfully, that now we find it strange that that even exists. Interesting stuff. We wrestled with God, okay? We fought with each other. We talked with friends. In other words, it seems like now they had an issue with God over the fact that this is the created order. You have sex with your wife, and guess what? The most likely eventuality, if you're not doing things in a certain way, is that this will bring forth a child, right? And we changed. We made our peace with God's plan. The 4th boy is now 7, and we love him with that indescribable love that is the blessing of parenting. He is a gift unlike any other. You have to couch that, I guess, in a sense, using that sort of language. That way they don't accuse you of being a father or a mother who is somehow antagonistic against having a child, right? The second truth is, I got a vasectomy. Lauren scheduled it for me, okay? We didn't need to talk about it. What? It never occurred to me to pray about it, okay? I never consulted a friend about it. I did not research it. I just tied off my ability to reproduce. Can we just pause here for a quick second? If the husband is the head of the household, how does this man allow his wife to simply state, this is what you're going to do, and you don't ask any questions, you don't have any reservations, you don't ask friends about it, you don't do any research on the matter, you just submit yourself to it without knowing what the potential side effects of this thing could be? You don't ask your wife, why did you make this decision without consulting me, being that I am the head of the household? This tells us a lot, folks. This in and of itself is already telling us a lot about this guy. And it kind of implies to me that we're talking about a situation here in a sense where it seems as if maybe the woman is the one that is having some sort of domination in that marriage. I'll read it again. The second truth is, I got a vasectomy. Lauren scheduled it for me. We didn't need to talk about it. It never occurred to me to pray about it. I never consulted a friend about it. I did not research it. I just tied off my ability to reproduce. But that way of making such a morally fraught decision was a mistake. Interesting. So he regrets the matter. Well, some will say, isn't that necessarily a good admission? Let's continue reading. T.S. Eliot called contraception the suicide of civilization. If you don't know who T.S. Eliot is, he was, if I'm not mistaken, an American. Was he British or American? I think he was an American poet and conservative in his values. Good poetry, by the way. Theodore Roosevelt called it, quote, the one sin for which the penalty is national death, end quote. G.K. Chesterton, who was a Catholic philosopher, was even more blunt. Quote, I despise British control, or birth control, because it's a weak and wobbly and cowardly thing, end quote. Birth control did change the world. Contraception pulled the plug, and American sexual ethics fell swiftly down the drain, at least he's admitting as much. The right to privacy emerged from access to contraception. Roe v. Wade and the sexual revolution followed closely behind, including a rampant pornography industry. So he himself is noticing the problems associated with all of this stuff. When I ran to the doctor to get a vasectomy in my mid-30s, I had no idea I was standing in a world created by such chaos. I was just trying to care for my family. Having now learned much more about the history of sexual ethics and the theology of the body, here's what I would recommend as a primer. First, I have come to believe that Christians should have a strong preference for natural family planning. I agree with that. Even my Catholic brothers and sisters admit and allow for natural family planning through abstinence at certain times of the month. That needs to be couched, because yes, there is certainly a biblical case to be made for that, especially from the Old Testament and on. One has to be very careful with that, though, because we are under grace, right? That has to be considered. But there are things, and I would encourage you to look these up. I'm not going to take the time on this edition to talk about it, but there are things that have been done by Christians for, again, centuries and centuries and centuries that don't violate biblical ethics, that don't violate biblical principles. As a matter of fact, they don't mutilate the body in any way, shape, or form of either the man or the woman, and they have been able to successfully avoid, as it were, having children or use natural forms of family planning, right? But here, when you look at this, he's using even my Catholic brothers and sisters, ecumenism there, right? Admit and allow for natural family planning through abstinence at certain times of the month. That has to be couched. Why do I say this? Well, because the thing is that unless you are couching this properly, unless you're giving proper parameters, you've got an issue here. There's a quote from Matthew Lee Anderson in this would be the third article, Christians Need Clearer Thinking About Sterilization, in which he quotes, this is what he wrote, quote, the only need that Scripture knows of regarding sex is the need that undergirds contraception, end quote. It's a very carefully crafted phrase, but you kind of understand what he's trying to get at there. So I'd like to read from the 1 Corinthians 7:3-5 here, because this is the Apostle Paul writing. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body. Some of you, and I have to pause here, would think, well then, Gio, why are you getting on the case of the wife for scheduling this vasectomy for the guy, if that's the case? Paul's not talking about mutilating the body so that kids won't be a byproduct of that. Paul is talking here about not denying the wife sex and not denying the husband sex. That's what he's talking about. Don't take it to where it doesn't go. But the wife does. Stop depriving, there it is, one another. Except, otherwise, if that's what you believe, then you would have to state that Paul, he himself, was saying, don't deprive your husband of a vasectomy and don't deprive your wife of tubal ligation. Doesn't make any sense. Stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Notice that seems to be the only allowance that the Apostle Paul is making here. And even then, when one asks for prayer, what does that even mean? You have to ask the question, what does that even mean? Prayer for what? I know Christians are uncomfortable with asking these questions, but you do need to ask those questions, because Paul himself is saying, don't be apart. There's a necessary reason for you to have that intimacy, by the way. And let me say this also. There are Christians who have a tendency to view sex as, maybe some Catholic apologists and others, the Quakers and others, have viewed sex. It's only for procreation. There's no such thing as pleasure. If that's the case, then we should just erase Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, however you'd like to call it, from the Bible, which is a celebration of sex between a husband and a wife. I don't care how many times, and I've said this over and over again, there are preachers throughout the years that have attempted to allegorize, present the Song of Songs as a mere allegory for the relationship that Christ enjoys with his church. Let me tell you something. That text is a clarion call for a husband to enjoy his wife and vice versa. That's what that text is about, okay? Because otherwise, then you'd have to think about this. You'd have to kind of state that, I guess Christ takes like a sexual pleasure in a sense, if you're going to adopt what some people have done with respect to Song of Solomon. And they say this is an allegory of the relationship that Christ enjoys with the church. So I guess Christ enjoys a bit of a sexual pleasure from his bride. Then you start thinking that, and you're thinking, yeah, that is kind of weird, isn't it? To me, I think the simplest is the best. The straightforward explanation here is the best. Here you have a text in the Bible where it tells you husband and wife enjoy each other's romance, enjoy each other's company, enjoy each other's sexual intercourse. Enjoy it. Enjoy it. It's part of it. Don't decouple it. I heard a pastor recently say, and rightfully so, and I'd like to echo that, I practically do not like it. I detest it because there's no allowance in Scripture for it, where suddenly you have segments of the Christian culture where they say it's one or the other. No, they're intimately tied in together because it's naturally a pleasurable thing. So why would you try to make one thing distinct from the other? That's just not, God created it that way. It's a pleasurable thing. It's for intimacy, and at the same time, a byproduct of that, an important byproduct of that, is having children. That's important. The text continues, stop depriving one another except by agreement for a time so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Notice that self-control there is not abstinence, but no, give yourselves over to each other continuously. This is an admonition from the Bible itself, telling husband and wife, be active sexually. So this is why I say earlier in this article, this is a problem when he uses the phrase natural family planning through abstinence at certain times of the month. But that phrase is so nebulous in a sense that it needs to be properly explained. What do you mean by that? Those certain times of the month, how long are they? What are the durations and for what reasons? Those particulars need to be known, right? Here you have the Bible telling you, do not separate. And then you've got other people now beginning to place certain, shall we say, qualifiers in place. I used to find their arguments cheeky, he continues. Don't ever separate the unitive and procreative aspects of sex unless you want to separate them by natural family planning, wink, wink. But I give it much greater respect now. Submitting to the natural rhythms of our bodies is a far healthier and far less ethically fraught means of family planning. Natural family planning requires we adjust our lives to our bodies, not our bodies to our lives. A century ago, there was a relative consensus in the church that our culture should be very cautious of birth control. Second, male contraception should be cautiously permissible. While natural family planning seems to be the wisest and safest choice, I find condoms or vasectomies permissible for a few reasons. To start, they put the burden on the male and require him to take initiative to control himself and alter his life when it comes to sex. So what happens to the wife in all of this? Because let's face it, men aren't the only ones that have sex drives. I hate to use this example, but I'm going to use it to prove the point. Nowadays, there is this general consensus among the populace that women are basically saints with respect to a lot of things and men are the deviants. If that's the case, why is there such a heavy amount of women whom are the so-called content creators of websites like Pornhub or OnlyFans? Men aren't the only ones with sex drives, folks. I thought we would know that by now, but evidently secularism has taken us to a place where even biological realities have to be reasserted over and over again for us to finally understand something that should be intuitive. This is healthy for men. When sex is offered to men with no responsibilities or restrictions attached, men, women, and children suffer. With men, when men are required to be responsible for sex, men, women, and children benefit. So in essence, it's lifting the responsibility that women have to not be seductresses. I told you the article was fraught with a bunch of issues. So men are ultimately responsible. It continues down this line that Christianity today has taken for some time now, where men are ultimately, it's toxic masculinity in essence, that's the problem. Women are saints. Women are angels. They are not to be touched because they are the closest things to cherubims that we have on earth. That is very interesting, to say the least, when the Bible has plenty to say about the seductress. Have you read Proverbs? Have you read what Solomon writes to his son? Male contraception also helps a man care for his family by allowing good and beautiful intimacy to flourish while stewarding his family's stage of life. But it should not be encouraged outside of marriage, since encouraged. Interesting choice of words. Instead of saying it should be frowned upon, fornication should be frowned upon, since according to Scripture, there is no place for sex outside of marriage, of course. I also believe this should not be used lightly to delay children for a long period of time or to create a culture where children are optional in marriage. I'll grant him that. I absolutely agree with him in that point. But when you are in a committed marriage with children and having more would create unwise health or mental health issues, I stand by the idea of male contraception as a possibility and a possibly wise option for a man to care for his wife and family. Yeah, the problem is that you've got massive issues with vasectomies. The fact that not only do they reduce eventually a man's testosterone and the various health issues associated with that, and in essence, just, if I could put it lightly, look it up and you'll find that I'm not lying, it just basically craters a man's manhood, in a sense, and everything that word encapsulates. So why, as it were, would you have the man do that when part of his virility, in a sense, part of his vitality comes from his manhood and everything that represents? He continues, these are admittedly narrow circumstances for male contraception to be used discerningly. There's that term again, there's that Christianese that they use in order to give extension, to give coverture, some would say, to an idea that inherently is anti-biblical. This is why I believe the church should move from a default posture of what's wrong with this to instead asking what is right about this. Yeah, but that second question, in essence, it already comes more from a place of automatic permissiveness. And I understand what is wrong with this. That question can also indicate on something an automatic prohibition, which a lot of things don't have. Paul himself says, all things are licit to me, all things are legal to me, but I'm not going to let myself be controlled by any of them, right? We have to keep that in mind. It's not a simple answer. The industry of contraception almost inevitably leads to a culture that is interested in not family planning, but untethered sex. So I admit that making exceptions for wise use in marriage is a very difficult ethical dilemma. Evangelicals can and should put more theological work into these questions. Third, female contraception should be strongly avoided. It is simply wrong for men to put the burden of family planning on altering more complex female biology. You'll note here that instead of talking about the same thing where in a sense you're mutilating the woman, as it were, in some way, shape, or form by doing what you do, tubal ligation or things of that nature, you have a situation or pharmacological solutions for these things, which again have their own issues. By the way, if I'm not mistaken, I think, and I don't know where this is, I have to research that again. I should have looked that up before I went live this evening. If I'm not mistaken, they've even talked about, I don't know if they finally deployed it or not, a birth control pill for men. I think they've been talking about that for some time, and now it's, if I'm not mistaken, they've even put it to market already, in a sense. So imagine the problems this is going to bring biologically to men. So it's a curious thing, the way that he frames this, where he is telling men, take the responsibility for the matter, even if it means that in a sense you have to alter negatively your manhood, in a sense, to do this. When, as I said earlier, if he would have just kept this as, let's just talk about natural family planning, I would have said, fine, not an issue there. There's plenty of methodologies out there that you can use in order to avoid pregnancies that have been perfectly healthy, perfectly biblical, not an issue. The fact that he's going to this, and not only that, now he's putting the onus, he's putting the burden on the man, as it were, and almost putting no responsibility whatsoever on the woman, as we've already quoted here. It fits in, as it were, with the feminist ideology, and you can see that there's an appeasement of that running through this article. Third, female contraception should be strongly avoided. It is simply wrong for men to put the burden of family planning on altering more complex female biology. It may even be evil when it is driven largely by a willingness to complicate or damage the female body to simplify and increase the pleasures of the male body. Well, don't a lot of women do the same thing to themselves so that they can increase the pleasures of the female body? In a world of pill-based birth control and intrauterine devices, has created a world where women are almost always expected to put their bodies through wild hormonal changes for the sake of sex without consequence. So you see that the angle, as I said earlier, here is one more from appeasement of the feminist vantage point and attacking the toxic patriarchy more than anything else here. He lets it known that that's his stance in all of this, and that's actually what's directing his conclusions in this article, not anything from a biblical foundation. Of course, some women use birth control for medical, hormonal, and health reasons, but the default, but if they have issues, why would you make an allowance for them to use them? You just mentioned that it's a problem. But the default assumption that women should be altering their bodies, and they italicize their bodies, to give men sex with no side effects puts the burden in the wrong place. So we men have put this burden on women so that we can get maximum enjoyment and they get nothing out of it. That's the framing. Men and women are better off when men are held to the very highest responsibility for sex. Again, women have no responsibility whatsoever, though that's the implication, the seeming implication in this. Further, some IUDs and birth control pills work as abortifacients since they don't allow an already created embryo to implant and grow. In vitro fertilization too often leads to discard or forgotten embryos. As Christians, we must challenge our consciences and advocate on these personal topics as much as we speak out on abortion. So here we have a situation where he's trying to present himself as necessarily a conservative or a conservative Christian, when in fact what's directing, what's propelling his commentary is more feminist ideology and appeasement of those ideas and of those people than actual biblical ethics in the matter. He finishes, if I could go back 7 years ago, I would make the same choice, but for entirely different reasons, and I would do it in an entirely different way. I would weigh the fact that I would be taking a step of incredible moral and physical significance. I would ask for counsel and prayer. I would read and think. I would act the same, probably with sobriety and reverence. This is so gay. It really is. It is. Stop it with all of this. I just have to pray about it. I have to think about. Come on. Should have been a man about this, But I did not. I simply got a vasectomy. That puts me in a long line of modern men and women who casually use all kinds of birth control with no serious consideration. We must reckon with our conscience, with church history, with the devastating impact of sterilization's common use, and with the hard ethical choices that accompany reproductive technologies. If we cannot find better practical ethics, then we may have to admit the historical church was right. Anyways, I think you basically got a good idea of what it is that Christianity today is trying to peddle here. So a couple of other articles, as I said earlier, that there's some other things that were stated on those other articles that are necessarily problematic, and we'll probably take this up again on Sunday. We'll see if nothing else breaks that I might want to prioritize for the Sunday transmission, but this is the general idea of what Christianity today is peddling. I think we've been able to demonstrate that the verbiage that is used here, and it proves various things. Number one, you'll find that experience and people, Christians or people, self-professed Christians, whom actually think more like the world, then try to justify those things to Christians by using certain type of language and flawed logic and a misinterpretation of biblical ethics to present it as biblically aligned. Number two, we find that we've got a group of people here whom, among other things, what they're attempting to do is appease those whom have embraced an ideology that necessarily goes against what the Bible says, and this has a direct impact on sexual ethics. And number three, this is also wildly dangerous because now you put yourself in a situation where you're actually giving advice to Christians who are on the right path, and now giving them sort of a misdeed that what they're doing is correct, and trying to alter them into another space, which in a sense leads them away from the proper biblical ethic, the proper scriptural ethic, into more of a worldly mindset. Various things that I wanted to talk about. I think we've been able to do that successfully on this edition. Be very careful, folks, with this sort of language. I've said it before. These people will use Christianese to give the impression, among other tactics, that they're coming from a right place, when in fact, when one considers this, weighs it against biblical evidence, you find that they're actually not only wrong, but actually advocating things that are harmful and diametrically opposed to what the Bible has to say. That's what I have for you on this edition of the live stream. I want to thank those of you that stuck around for the entirety of the presentation once and last for this edition. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, click the thumbs up, and share our content if you haven't already. We would certainly approve. We will certainly thank you for doing that. I will remind the audience that our next live stream is on Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Do not forget to donate. It helps us to continue to do these live streams for your edification and information. There's a QR code. You can find it on the upper left-hand corner of the screen. There's a link in the description box beneath that you can click on as well. Last but not least, follow us on the socials, on TikTok, The Irrespective, and on X, you can follow us via the username Irrespective77. That's all the time we have left for this edition. Thank you so much for joining. Until the next occasion that we gather, I wish you Godspeed.